published, as she was the longest serving current member of the board of the Humanities Center. But Erica was my student. Sorry. So I've known her for 30 years. It's a very, actually the second student that when you realize you've starting to outlive your students, it's kind of very difficult, especially when you're outliving your favorite students. So Erica was my student. She was an extraordinary person. She had a fairly hard life. Before she was a law student, she was a single mom. She was a single mom when she was going to law school. She had been the only woman working in a nuclear power plant. Something about her strength, her integrity. She was the compliance officer, so she wasn't the most popular person in that plant either. And this came up when we had a little, I don't know how to describe it, a meeting. Her children were there, reminiscing about her. And I said that I always had the sense that nothing was difficult for Erica, because when she faced some difficulty, she said to herself, this is not as hard as the nuclear power plant. Erica had sitting on her desk, and it now sits on my desk, one of those little Zen gardens, with the sand and the stones. I have it sitting on my desk. That's not that I needed to remember her, but it symbolizes her to me, because she was quiet. There was such strength underneath there, such intelligence. I don't think most of my colleagues actually understood exactly how smart she was. But I did, because I taught her, so. And she was not the kind, she was humble in that sense. She had a true humility, I think. But she was fierce and angry when she saw injustice. And that was something that, knowing her as long as I did, I knew was always there. But other people only saw it in those kinds of situations. So it's a terrific loss for me personally, for us in the law faculty and for the Humanities Center. I'll close with this thought. I'm in the process of writing a little memorial for her for the law review, which I found very difficult for the reasons that you can probably see. One of her favorite movies was Babette's Feast. You know the story. It's based on a short story by Hiddleston. Babette was one of the communards, right? And went to the barricades in 1848 in Paris and were suppressed by the army. So that's where the term communism comes from, in fact, communism. In the story, she is the poor housekeeper of these two elderly women who run a very ascetic sect, Christian sect in Denmark. Babette, the housekeeper, wins the lottery, and she takes all of her earnings and she spends it on the most fabulous dinner for the congregation. They're all ascetics, so they all agree not to enjoy it. And she cooks this extraordinary dinner of turtle soup. She has a live turtle. If you haven't seen the movie, he has the resistance as a quail with foie gras in a puff pastry. And there's one guest who's the nephew of one of the congregants who is a general in the army and had been stationed in Paris. He had also once been one of the suitors of one of the elderly sisters. And he says, this is the signature dish of the Café d'Artiste in Paris. And I've never seen it before anywhere else but there. Of course, at the end of the movie, Babette says to the sisters, I was the chef at the Café d'Artiste. And they're a little stunned, and they say, well, I would guess you're going back to Paris now that you're rich. You've won 10,000 francs. And she said, no, I spent all of that on the dinner. Right? And she said, dinner for 12 at the Café d'Artiste cost 10,000 francs. And they said, but now you're poor. And she said, an artist is never poor.
I'm wondering if you would accommodate the Humanities Center as standing for 1 minute as to honor a former member of the American board that served us very well for many years.
social and political science.
This is a hearty bunch to be here. I want to first echo my colleague Steve Winter's appreciation of Erica Beach Ramones. I didn't know her anywhere near as well as Stephen did. But she really was an important force within the law school and within the campus, and someone who helped to bridge what is often a seeming chasm between the professional school on the one hand and the humanities on the other. And so she's greatly missed as a colleague. Well, I am speaking here today, broadly speaking, about what might be called the deplatforming controversies. That is to say, this spate of conflicts that have occurred on university campuses and some other places in the course of the last few years that have to do with the question of who should be allowed by the audience to speak, who should be shouted down, if anyone, who should be disrupted, whether indeed there is something fundamentally wrong and fundamentally uncivil with actions being taken by people in the community who want to say about people who they view as purveyors of hate speech that we are not having this conversation, that this speech is not welcome here, this is not who we are as a community, and we're not prepared to tolerate that. And so the title of the talk is Tolerating Purveyors of Hate Speech, Civility or Complicity. I'll start with a little quotation from Herbert Marcuse, who in the 1960s wrote an essay called Repressive Tolerance. And he said, when tolerance mainly serves the protection and preservation of a repressive society, when it serves to neutralize opposition and render men immune against other and better forms of life, then tolerance has been perverted. When the false consciousness has become prevalent, the national and popular behavior, it translates itself almost immediately into practice. The safe distance between ideology and reality, repressive thought and repressive action, between the word of destruction and the deed of destruction is dangerously shortened. And so this is really something, a concept that frames the issue here. And what I really want to do in this talk is to really address what has become this extraordinarily vituperative confrontation between what might be called the left center and the center left over this question about freedom of expression versus suppression of hate speech. It is, I think, at a moment when we face an extraordinary challenge, the likes of which have already been described obliquely and otherwise in the course of the day from the particular administration that we have in Washington and from other political authorities. It's very vexing to see this kind of vituperative clash among people who should all be on the same side in the face of this. So I would like to shed some light on the issue about deplatforming or suppression of what is purported to be hate speech, really as a way of trying to convert this from an issue into a problem. That is to say, to see this not as an illustration of a deeper divide and something that exposes the deep sort of moral rot of the other side of the debate, but rather as a problem that we face, being people generally of a progressive orientation who are looking to grapple with a problem in a serious way. And what I want to do is, first of all, to rebut what I regard as the trivialization and oversimplification of the grievances of those who are engaged in such protests, and to try to make what I consider to be the soundest arguments on behalf of those who are dedicated to the proposition that certain things must not be allowed to be said here. And on the other side, to try to expose the real perils, ethical and political, of these kinds of exercises of power from below. I don't have a bumper sticker solution to this question. I do think that both sides have been saying things about these issues that are fundamentally wrong, can be exposed as being wrong, and that the real issues, the real problems have to be developed in a more serious way, and one that is more generous on the part of both the center-left and the left-center toward each other with respect to this question. So the first thing, we've had a conference about civility today. I haven't heard anyone try to define civility. And one of the difficulties with definitions of civility is that very frequently people read other sort of moral principles into the idea of civility that lends civility a certain kind of substance that skews the discourse. Many things are uncivil, but what's wrong with them is something other than their being uncivil. So slander is uncivil, but it's wrong because it's slander, not because it's uncivil. So the real question is how one thinks about what incivility is. And I also want to think about civility in terms of civil society, in terms of the political significance of the moment in which civility is or is not deployed, because it's not simply a matter of personal virtue. And indeed, one of the difficulties of tolerance as a concept and tolerance of different points of view is that it tends to reduce the question to a personal question about virtue and your willingness to be a kind of open person who's willing to engage with other people and respect them as human beings. And that's fine, but in the political context, you have responsibilities as an actor not merely to the people upon whom you're acting, but also to the people on whose behalf you purport to be acting. When you step into a political role, you have other kinds of responsibilities, and sometimes being civil to someone actually sends a kind of destructive political message. So the question is, what is civility? I think for these purposes, civility means treating your interlocutor as someone who belongs as part of this conversation. And the fact is that some people don't belong in the conversation. And acquiescing in their presence in the conversation actually has all manner of secondary effects with respect to people often who are not in the room, who are the objects of the conversation, and people whose perspectives are going to be foreclosed in a conversation where a particular participant in the conversation is going to be able to establish as legitimate a particular framework of the discussion. And so the difficulty here is that you have people who are looking to open certain kinds of questions that ought to be closed. And this is what creates the kind of clash with the free speech sensibility, which wants to say that all questions ought to be open questions. The problem is that when the question that you're opening is the question of equal concern and respect for all members of the community, when what you're opening is the question of whether certain parts of the community that have been historically subordinated and excluded and disparaged and marginalized actually belong there, you are, in opening that question, in some sense, being complicit in the undermining of the status of those persons. And this is not because it hurts people's feelings. And I actually think that both sides are, in some ways, guilty in this discourse of fixating on this idea that certain speech is hurtful because it bothers people, because it makes people feel unwelcome, and so on. These are problems in the real world, and sometimes they actually have real concrete effects on people, but for reasons I'll discuss later, I don't think they can be the criteria for making determinations about what sort of speech we can accept. But the real problem is not what sort of effects it has on people's psyches when they're confronted with disparagements. The problem is that this, in a very real way, poisons the well. That by normalizing a certain kind of discourse about people who have already been historically marked out for subordination and marginalization and exclusion, one is in fact making life in the society more dangerous for those people, making those people more likely to confront violence, making those people more likely to confront discrimination, making those people more likely to confront harassment and other kinds of perhaps subtle forms of displacement from society's public spaces in important ways. So to make it sound as though this is a problem about snowflakes, This is one of the most irritating things, I have to say, that I have ever heard in academic discourse. And I blame Jonathan Haidt for this, and more about him later for anyone who wants to hear me rant. But the idea that the problem here is that we have to, people are hypersensitive, they have hurt feelings, they need to be protected because they've been coddled all their lives before they came to college. This could not be more irrelevant to the actual issue here. The issue here has to do with the way in which society does or does not incorporate on an equal basis with equal standing certain parts of the community that have heretofore been treated very badly. And so I think it's very important to recognize what the actual stakes of this are. And to point out, too, that questions about civility and incivility are questions about, ultimately, the stakes of conflict. That, in fact, to attack people for being uncivil is, in many cases, to be disparaging the very stakes of the conflict that they experience. And I could give several examples about how people have reacted in that way. I think I may skip that, other than to say there was a particular episode that I was involved with on this very stage some years ago, involving a group at the University of California in Irvine. Some of you might be familiar with the Irvine 11, who disrupted a speech of the Israeli ambassador in the wake of the Israeli bombardment of the Gaza Strip. A conflict that took the lives of 13 Israelis and 1,300 Palestinians, as you might recall. This was the Irvine 11 did not seek to prevent Oren from speaking. They disrupted in a rather moderate way to demonstrate the fact that this was not normal, that we could not normalize Oren, whose main role at that point was as apologist for Operation Cast Lead. And he was not only there to give a talk, he was there to receive an honor from the university. He was an honored guest of the university. And from a particular perspective, what he was an apologist for criminality. Now, maybe he was and maybe it wasn't. The question of the criminality of Operation Cast Lead is a live question, and I'm not seeking to prejudice that discussion. But the real problem is the disparagement of the Irvine 11, who ended up facing criminal charges, believe it or not, for conspiracy to commit a misdemeanor, if you can believe it, for having engaged in this moderate form of disruption that allowed Oren actually to speak, but which sought effectively to withdraw from below what they saw as an honor wrongfully conferred from above. And it seemed to me that whatever one thinks about whether this was a good idea or the pros and cons of the underlying question, the disparagement of these young people who were really quite courageous and paid a big price really was quite out of line. In fact, was uncivil. And so these questions kind of collapse in on themselves. I say all of this in some respect to highlight the fact that if you want to be a real advocate for civility, and under most circumstances I am, you have to recognize the limits of civility. Just as if you want to be taken seriously as an advocate for peace, you have to renounce pacifism. Because you're not going to convince anybody. Pacifists are fine, but pacifists are inert politically because they cannot convince people for whom the question of war or peace is one that is sensitive to actual circumstances. And so you need to actually, to have credibility on the question of civility and its desirability, you need to understand something about the limits. Another thing I want to focus on here, and I'm not going to get all the way through the things I want to say in the amount of time that I have, but I want to talk a little bit about freedom of speech and its relationship to the First Amendment, because this is another area where people have a tendency to oversimplify mightily. First of all, freedom of speech and the First Amendment are not one and the same thing. Free speech principles transcend the question of the First Amendment. The First Amendment pertains to governmental action. Free speech is a much broader proposition and deals with the responsibilities, the ethical responsibilities that we have as citizens to one another, as well as governmental action. But also, free speech is not reducible to what the Supreme Court, in its contemporary jurisdiction, its contemporary jurisprudence, has determined count as the rules of First Amendment law. So again, another haughty thing that gets said about the demonstrators is these people just don't understand free speech. They don't understand it's right there. That hate speech is protected. It's right there in the Constitution. No, the Constitution literally says something that you cannot possibly mean, which is that Congress can make no law abridging freedom of speech. So therefore, it can't make consumer fraud laws, presumably. There are lots and lots of crimes you can commit just by speaking. That's not what freedom of speech means in that context. And so freedom of speech has meant many different things, actually, since 1791. And only recently, only in the last 2 generations, has it come to mean what it's understood as meaning now. And the most fundamental thing it's understood as meaning now is something called viewpoint neutrality. There's no such thing as free speech absolutism, but there is such a thing as viewpoint neutrality. And viewpoint neutrality works in a very odd way. It operates from the premise that, constitutionally speaking, there's no such thing as a false idea. It's not because people who say this think that there's no such thing as a false idea. They're saying that from the standpoint of governmental regulation of speech, we cannot have the government take sides with respect to a battle of ideas. What's weird about that is the most important case decided on this about 25 years ago was R.A.V. versus St. Paul about cross-burning. And the idea here was that even if the speech is otherwise regulable, you can't discriminate against hate speech and allow other kinds of speech to go unimpeded in the same category. That you actually can't discriminate against racists who might use cross-burning as a way of expressing themselves without equally having a kind of viewpoint neutral regulation with respect to any other way that people might offensively express themselves in ways that would amount to what's called fighting words, which I won't get into. So there's it's a very rigid rule about viewpoint neutrality with respect to this matter. This didn't come from 1791. It was not the rule in 1952 when the Supreme Court of the United States in Beauharnais versus Illinois upheld the idea of group libel, which is to say hate speech against particular groups. And that was considered to be within the scope of constitutional regulation at that time. That being said, Beauharnais versus Illinois was part of a long line of cases in First Amendment law that are just awful. And so if you want to go back to Beauharnais versus Illinois, you may be buying back into a series of constitutional decisions that were permissive of a tremendous amount of speech regulation, going all the way back to the Supreme Court holding the 1918 Sedition Act, which is, if I were to read to you the statute, you would be just astonished that such a statute would actually be passed in the United States, let alone held. So what I want to point out then is that there's a real difference between the essence of freedom of speech, which is understood very differently in foreign democracies like Canada, and understood very differently in international human rights law than it is by the Supreme Court of the United States. And so the idea that the essence of free speech is inherently this idea of viewpoint neutrality is not a broadly shared liberal democratic principle, it's just the one we've got. As a matter of First Amendment law. I think there are justifications for viewpoint neutrality as a constraint on how government regulates speech. But the idea that the spirit of the First Amendment represents this constraint on how we think about freedom of speech and incorporates viewpoint neutrality, I think is quite problematic. Many other things to be said, but just to wrap up, let me say that there are very real perils to the kinds of deplatforming campaigns and so forth that have been carried out. One thing that we really have not seen from those who favor these kinds of actions is a set of serious criteria about what does and does not count as hate speech. Hate speech has been judicially defined in certain jurisdictions. It could be defined. But if you end up with this situation in which if you crack down on one thing and people are unwilling to crack down on that thing, you have to crack down on the people who are unwilling to crack down on it, and then you have to crack down on the people who are unwilling to crack down on that. And so the problem now, I mean, the sort of reductio ad absurdum is in this last week of William and Mary, the director of the ACLU was shouted down because the ACLU was defending the rights of people that they didn't want to have speak to speak, and therefore the ACLU shouldn't get to speak speak either. This is a really big problem. And I think that what we have to do is particularly avoid a collapse into a discussion about sensibilities where we're necessarily going to try to tie the suppression of speech to people's subjective reactions, which will necessarily lead to vagueness and overbreadth to concepts I could go into at great length, but that necessarily make a mess out of not only any legal framework, but any ethical framework for dealing with people's expression. So with that, I bid you thanks.
For questions?
So, I don't know if I agree with the definition, but I don't think that will take a lot of going back and forth. But there are various institutions in society that have different kinds of functions. There's the justice system, there's legislatures, there's universities. And so I think universities is having, one of its main functions is trying to figure out or pursue the truth. And those kinds of aims aren't easily overridden by consequentialist considerations, I think. And so I think that's what speaks strongly strongly against incivility in academic institutions. There's a way to let people speak, and of course, if they're saying hate speech, there ought to be an opportunity somewhere in a panel or something for somebody else to counter it. But that's one thing, and to be uncivil in the context seems to be something else that would require quite a bit of consequentialist support to justify it. Maybe it'd be fine if was it Irvine, wasn't it? Outside the lecture hall for people to protest and the like. But I think there should be this open space left for anybody to say anything as long as it doesn't incite a riot or something like that. And then I want them to come on top. I want the Nazis to come here, and I want to be able to respond to it.
Well, and I could throw that back. Why do you want the Nazis to come here?
Because I want people to hear what's wrong with their view. This is an institution aimed at the truth, and there's some truth to this matter.
Well, there is some truth to this matter, but the question is, do we want to reopen the question? And we've known each other a long time. We've been batting these balls back and forth for a long time. You're sort of a professional debater, and that's all well and good. But the difficulty is that you're really making the stakes of that discourse that take place at any given moment, perhaps in the hands of someone not as evil as you. That where you can lose an argument to a Holocaust denier if you don't come armed with all of the talking points, if you haven't seen behind and anticipated every talking point that this person is going to have. You are going to potentially lend credibility to ideas that make no contribution to truth because they have been so systematically refuted, and the opening the door to them is so pernicious in terms of undermining an understanding in the society that really represents, I think, what we have to borrow from the odious Wilmore Kendall, who I was otherwise going to talk about today. But he spoke about public truth, which is a standard that society has a right to defend. And I think that basically any pursuit of truth and any other activity in society is predicated ultimately on a certain set of principles that Nazism cannot be part of. Nazism cannot be part of the accommodation that we have with our fellow citizens about how we're going to manage disagreement, because there's some disagreement that's beyond the scope of that accommodation.
I just want to say I'm a mediocre debater, and there are a lot more people right here, and there better be in the university who are very good debaters.
Is lying considered a form of speech?
Well, lying, you can of course think about things in different ways, but lying, of course, is a form of actionable speech as a matter of ordinary law. You can be, in fact, sued for libel. You can be prosecuted for fraud. There are all sorts of ways, and obviously you can commit perjury. So there are all of these things that, of course, are speech, but they're regulable speech in particular circumstances. And of course, if you lie to your friend about whatever, then you're not engaged in a legally significant act. But lying is as much a form of speech as anything else, I would say.
I guess the reason why I just threw it out there like that, because I understood it before I said it in terms of some of the reasons that you gave. But I guess the question is now is because we're getting unhealthy doses of lying on a very large scale. And the fact that it's being normalized, does that suggest that there are some major breakdowns in societal norms? And if not breakdowns, huge fissures somewhere?
Yeah. I think it's really extraordinary what's happening, and the idea of fake news is something that I personally hadn't heard of. I mean, I remember the National Enquirer, but I've never seen anything like this, and particularly kinds of coordinated campaigns to get people to believe things that aren't true, that are relevant to public policy. And that does create all sorts of difficult problems because on the one hand, who do you trust to regulate what is and is not fake news? And the practical problems about governmental regulation go to really nitty-gritty questions like that. And on the other hand, the idea that a free marketplace of ideas is going to bring us out of this problem, neglects the fact that a market, in fact, requires regulation when there are market failures, and this is a form of market failure.
Thank you.
Isn't this sort of a way, in a way we say, the society is sort of saying to itself, how do we correct socially a bad idea if we don't know what it is? That if people don't speak their mind, no matter how crazy, we can't sort of correct them. Is that, in a sense, is that society what we're sort of struggling with here, that knowledge of what is wrong can have a corrective effect?
Yeah, it might, and it might have other kinds of effects too. I mean, John Stuart Mill famously took the position that if we don't confront the things that are wrong, we'll forget why we're right. That we need to actually these arguments to hone our own better arguments. But I think the difficulty is a lot of times it's not that we don't know what these arguments are, and if we normalize them, if we provide them a place that gives them a certain kind of respect and dignity, we might find ourselves creating spaces in the society where this can incubate. And it doesn't require that they win an election. It doesn't require that they have an enormous critical mass in order to work harm. Rather small groups of people can work a tremendous amount of harm. And so, but you raise an important practical question, and there's also some sort of tipping point where, we can't continue to neglect, we can't continue to ignore something that's built to a certain critical mass. I think we're probably out of time.
I think you're
Our next speaker is Ken Jackson, Professor and Chair of the English Department.
Thank you. Make sure you use the cards.
I will.
Keep me on target. Thank you for staying this late. I want to begin with one respectful civil disagreement with our keynote speaker, she was really an academic capacity, Professor Herbst, when she made the distinction between civility and other forms of human activity, say courtesy, politeness, manners. I think those things blur together in some complicated way, particularly in the context she was discussing, which is K-12 education and undergraduates. I think those things are very difficult to discuss, they're very difficult to define, and very difficult to tease out, but nonetheless we need to try to do so, and that's part of my presentation today, which involves a return to, this book may be very familiar to some, completely new to others, Norbert, Elias, The Civilizing Process. And in some ways I just want to put this up here because in the modern media craziness, it seems lots of people think the only sociologist who ever lived or ever was Charles Murray. We live in very strange times. So for none other reason, I put Elias up here. The book had an unusual publication history and an unusual history of academic reception. That is, it was published, as you see, in 1939, hit war times, came back in translation in 1969, right in a moment when the Weberian kind of ideas or structures that Elias was working in were very unpopular, and that was complicated by the fact that Elias was making an argument about how history and society function top-down. and lots of critics, political critics particularly at the time, were very agitated and nervous by the fact that when one talks about such processes, that one is also advocating for them rather than just critiquing or looking at them. So very quickly, let me review Elias. What Elias argues is our manners, our courtesy, our civility originate in the need for European aristocracy to distinguish itself from lower or middling classes. In short, at one time, social structures were divided by who was the best warrior. As society got more complicated, the aristocracy needed different ways to distinguish themselves, and they came up with a whole system, a way of behaving, dressing, talking differently, eating differently, and we'll talk about toileting differently, sleeping differently, and that's where our manners came from, and those manners were most refined, of course, around the court. Hence our term courtesy. So that is to say, all our manners, even today, are a polite way of being derived from a vertical, top-down, hierarchical structure. And to the extent I have a thesis or argument today, it's simply this, is that part of our difficulty of dealing with issues like civility in America is how do you live in America, which is borrowed this vertical structure, when the rest of our ideas are supposed to be horizontal in some way. And in short, this is a historical problem that we've never come to terms with. One of our bad habits of mind of late is we refer to history and we point out history in parts of our everyday arguments to say, oh, this has happened before, which is true, and then we leave it at that, as if that has some explanation, as if our understanding of history can't alter things in some way. And I think, again, to the extent I want to make claims here, I want to make the claim that looking back at Elias's argument and considering its truth, and then accepting at least its persuasive power, if not its truth, to what way can we intervene and understand that we're living in the wake of this history, which is causing us lots and lots of problems, as many of them have been addressed today. Okay, so again, quickly on the civilizing process tutorials, you know what I'm talking about. Something as basic as the handshake. You know what I mean when I extend my hand to Brad. Brad doesn't have to shake it. We don't have soap or anything like that. But we all know pretty much in the room where the handshake came from. At least we know nominally where it came from, correct? Why do we use the handshake as a gesture? No one shows the open gesture. So behind all our manners, all our courtesy, all our gestures of civility is this hidden violence, which is also what we've been talking about here. Between Brad, I agree with him completely on this, the stakes, the seriousness of what's going on today in terms of our trying to negotiate between civility and incivility. The handshake, of course, is just one familiar and naturalized, normalized gesture that we've come to kind of accept, but there are plenty of others, Elias would have argued. One would be that our very eating habits, that no one ever used knives and fork, and there was no particular reason to use knives and fork until the aristocracy started using knives and forks because it set them apart from everyone else, and everyone else started imitating them. The knife, of course, was a very threatening weapon to have at the table, hence the fork. It kind of took the sting out of things a little bit. Our sleeping habits, right? We tend to sleep alone or sleep with someone we like, or sleep with someone we're comfortable with. Most of us come to prefer to sleep alone at some point. Where did that come from? Well, in the medieval court and into the early modern court, sleeping alone, having your own room, was a sign of distinction. It was a sign of social distinction. It was one way that you were marked apart from those below you. But again, as people started to look at those habits, started to adopt them because they wanted to move up the social ladder, those things became normalized and naturalized. Same thing with our toileting habits, right? It's quite natural for us to want some degree of privacy when we're in the privy. That wasn't, of course, always the case. It would have been completely normal for a monarch to take care of business in front of any number of servants or people beneath them. In fact, that was one way of signaling, again, his superiority in the social status. Those things come down to us today. I mean, I don't think it's apocryphal. Someone probably knows the history better, but at least I think it's in the Carroll biographies. LBJ was famous for inviting people in when he was on the can to make sure they knew who was boss when they were talking to LBJ. Again, whether that's true or not, leave up to the historians. But again, it's a remnant of this. Okay, thank you. Yeah. It's a remnant of this medieval, early modern court history, which again we're still living with. Again, in a nutshell, all our manners, all our civility involve masking or managing basic biological impulses, what Elizabeth might refer to as affective feelings or powers or things like that. We manage aggression via the handshake. We manage the aggression with our academic colleagues by saying, that's interesting, rather than we manage our fear in all sorts of ways. We manage our fatigue. Our students, lots of you people sitting here are completely fatigued and exhausted and tired, but you're still making a good show of things. You're sitting upright, you're making eye contact, you're doing all the good things to show me that no matter what you're feeling, you're still a very civil, polite audience. And again, they're conflating these two sort of important, in important terms. Our bowel functions, etc. You know, why when we sit down, you know, the food is brought to the table, why do we wait? We no longer fart at ease at the table, at least in sort of polite company. That, again, never used to be the case. But all of these things came to be naturalized or normalized so that we could not only function in a, what was called a civilized world or a vertical world, but we could move up. These were things you had to learn. Okay? You had to learn, and then you had to learn how to control what you were feeling, whether in your gut or in your head or your emotions. And then you had to act out the proper mannerisms to get by. And if you didn't learn that, you were in trouble. Okay? And again, we all learn to do these by watching, controlling, and then imitating usually those above us. And this is one of the things that everyone is naturally terrified about, I think, at the moment, given the current state of Washington, D.C., which is to say, if this is what's at the top of the social pyramid that everyone is in some way watching, imitating, and looking at, we have substantial, serious problems there. Okay, so again, this stuff is not hard. I mean, Elias, I'm giving you a thumbnail version of Elias in his argument, which is his historicism is pretty impressive. But again, this is historicism that one can take easily in if you've ever been to junior high or middle school, at least in an American system, or frankly, if you've ever had the first day of a job, which is to say, in junior high, one of the first things you learn to do is figure out who's at the top of the social pyramid and imitate their manners, fashions. What are they wearing? What are they doing? How are they acting? We all like to think we pass through those kind of processes when we get to be an adult, but of course we don't. Whatever job, culture we move into that first day, if you have any sense whatsoever, you shut your mouth, you open your eyes, and you watch, and then you pay attention to the people that you want to be, etc., etc. This is, again, at the heart of Elias, and this is the system of manners or courtesy that has been passed down to us, and it has informed our civility. Why do I like talking about this stuff? Well, it's perfectly well registered in literature. I'm an English professor. I can't give you about 45 seconds of literature here. You all remember I put these particular texts up here because I'm assuming everyone had some form of the English survey. So you remember our good friend Beowulf, right? Not exactly the most mannerly guy in the world. But we don't know, I always tell my students, we don't know what Beowulf looked like, right? We imagine him as Conan the Barbarian, Arnold Schwarzenegger, but nowhere in the manuscript, the text of Beowulf, this very long thing, he's an epic hero, we have no idea what he looks like. None whatsoever, no physical description except that he's powerful. One good reason for that, of course, is it didn't matter a hill of beans what Beowulf looked like. It mattered that Beowulf could achieve his social ascendancy via his physical prowess, right? We move forward a couple hundred years, we move on to an author like Chaucer, right? And all of a sudden with Chaucer, where the world has changed, and how we dress, how we talk, how we smell, right? How we move is becoming that much more important. All of a sudden, Chaucer puts a microscope on society. So in Chaucer's fiction, we start to see the miller's nose. Not only do we see the miller's nose, we see the hair on the miller's nose, right? We're looking as close as we can, and we start to see this intense sort of self-consciousness develop. This self-consciousness which is necessary in growing and developing, because in order to enact out our manners, we need a tremendous amount of self-control, biological self-control. And again, I'm referring back to our latest president, Obama, and the sort of masterful sort of performance he put on under all sorts of circumstances, all sorts of stresses, was able to put on a mask. An extraordinary mask, an extraordinary performance to hide and mask any aggression or resentment and sorts of things like this. The big example, probably the less well-known example, is probably the West, I would argue, the West's most influential book, and by the way, that's coming from a guy who does religion, and so the Bible and Shakespeare. I would say in the West, and particularly in Western political discourse, the most important book is Baldassare Castiglione's The Courtier, which was a conduct manual which taught courtiers how to behave, how to succeed at court. This was a self-help manual, a DIY manual before the time. It had its own elongated publishing history, but it was read by everyone who was anyone, and it was read with that attention that you read things when you actually need to do something and it's important to you. And what Castiglione talked about a lot was achieving a heightened sense of manners and courtliness to the point where you could develop, and everyone, I hope people know this word, sprezzatura, right? The Italian, great sort of old Italian word, sprezzatura, is the art of making the difficult look easy. In modern parlance, we might call it style or grace. It's that peculiar quality which we reserve for the top of the top. And again, go back to President Obama, right? Who was renowned for not only pulling off this mask or veil, I mean, you could say Nixon did that. Nixon always looked civil, but the sweat was pouring down, looked miserable sort of doing it, still is on pictures today. Whereas Obama did it and he made it look easy, when we know, of course, it wasn't easy at all. Okay, it took an extraordinary amount of self-control. One last literary example, and then Henry James' American. This is the American, one of James's early novels, not read anymore. It should be. This is a great clash, sort of pre-war, where the American character Christopher Newman does his world tour. He's made a ton of money, and he goes over to Europe when you still have remnants of the European aristocracy, that system very much in place, the court system very much in place before the war. And Newman, this American who wants to find a wife, amongst other things, and he wants to be cultured and he wants to be an American aristocrat of sorts, is confronted by particularly the French, who look at them and say, why are you smiling so much, right? Why do you make these big, strong gestures? Why do you talk so loud? In short, why haven't you learned our European system of manners, which is this tight, controlled, affective management, right, that has come to constitute, in many ways, what lots of us call, or want to, when we think of civility, particularly kids in K-12, they can't distinguish between our whole system of post-enlightenment legal structures, rules, protocols, sort of things like that, or academic argumentation or something like that. They blur those things together. So what is civil is a controlled, managed, elegant, graceful front. So again, that's the courtier. So what am I arguing, or what am I suggesting, or what do I want to talk about? One thing is, I've always thought, is in America, we need a wholesale reinvention of what we mean by civility. People brought up, it's really hard to define. There have been some very good definitions of it, and it's kind of like obscenity, we know it when we see it. But for what is supposedly a egalitarian democratic society, we need a whole different system of manners, courtesy, and civility, which is aligned with that, rather than trying to pursue this vertical one, which always puts us into difficult power relations, which is to say, there's always someone on top that you're imitating, right? What would this look like? Again, borrowing a lot from Elizabeth, I don't know. I don't have any answers. But I just think referring to this history is incredibly necessary, particularly right now. We talked, Professor Herbst talks about 1850s, that moment of American civility, and then where that led to the 1860s. Well, the moment before the 1850s, and frankly, probably the moment that produced the 1850s, was that turn from the revolutionary court structure of the Founding Fathers to Jacksonian democracy, which reshaped America, and then that whole generation led us into the 1850s, I would sort of argue. And we're in another kind of one of those moments right now with Trumpism, which is this enormous reaction to a kind of civility, or a vertical structured civility that can't be mirrored, or can't be easily mirrored or imitated. That's amplified by social media, but how that happens, I'm not exactly sure. But again, what I would press for, and what I would ask us to discuss more openly, is this long history, and to try to discover a means of civil discourse that didn't involve this vertical process of integration. That, to me, is what is most pressing. Thanks. Maybe I'll prompt the question. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jackson. If we're gonna reinvent civility on a wholesale scale,
guess it'd be a whole different thing, wouldn't it? It'd be a whole different word and everything, right?
You know,
That's what we mean.
Yeah, and I don't mean to full out, and by the way, when it comes, push comes to shove, I'm with Brad's position on this, and sort of, Professor Roth's position on this, you know, more or less, but nonetheless, I think in our imaginative capacity, we can't ignore this kind of history because we keep getting trapped in the same it's almost mathematical formula traps, where you're looking up, you're imitating, you're getting irritated because you can't pull it off. And again, I think there is, I don't mean to, I sound like, you know, George Will in The American Fabric or something like, you know, there's something in the American culture which resists, right? That kind of
something in language that exists.
Exactly, that sort of resists.
How do we escape the historical context of the creation?
Yeah, yeah, well, how do you escape that? You know, this is why partly this screaming about elites and things like this, yes.
I think also, I wonder also in terms of not only the vertical, but in terms of dominance also in terms of what is civil and what's not civil.
Yeah.
So that first day of junior high, first day on the job, if you're not, if you're African American male, African American female, or Latino male, it's something that you're not a white male.
Yeah.
There's certain norms and behaviors you have to automatically do, or you will not survive in that environment. And I think about being civil, what that means for communities that are raising their children in terms of you behave one way in middle school, one way in the community, and it kind of stress that I think about the 1960s when African Americans went through this whole phase of big afros, different clothes, a different way of talking, a different way of being. And I think that to the civil, it was a great deal of stress on those people who are on the outside. In terms of what is, and I agree, I don't know what civil is, but we know when we see it.
Or now, you know, again, the European structure, in some ways it was easier because you had one court structure, which usually didn't look that different across England, Spain, and, you know, et cetera. But now we're broken up into different little social pyramids where so many people are having to learn different performances.
And also on job, outside the academy, if you go to AT&T or General Motors, different jobs, and look at who's been written up, a lot of the conflict is over people misunderstanding how people are behaving or talking.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the issue too in terms of this kind of idea of, we have this, I think, power arrangements also that I can power, but these different arrangements that people have to abide to.
Yeah. Well, again, it's no surprise too, like a lot of sort of Elias critics were sympathetic to him rather than harsh. Pointed out, the pinnacle of this was the end of the 19th century when you had all the modern pressures swirling, but you still had a European court structure, more or less, for social hierarchy. And it's no surprise that, Freudian psychoanalysts came at that moment where, this anxiety of having to constantly perform or act in different areas all the time when there certainly was one dominant group, and it was increasingly harder for anyone, and in Freud's case it was all female patients, right? How do you manage this? How do you manage this when you are not the one at the top of the social pyramid setting the terms or setting the boundaries for what civility would be? No, I agree.
So I understand that there may be some tension between the CP, civilizing the process of the vertical process, and the horizontal process that Professor Roth points out, that who is included in civil society are ones, or at least in conversation, are ones who recognize equal concern and respect of others. But can we understand civility as a concept or an idea that's subject to moral progress? So when we talk about civil society in the 1600s, for Locke, for example, civil society is an idea or a society that's in contrast with state of nature, right? So you get out of state of nature, which is lawlessness, and you form a society where you bind yourself to certain kinds of rules. And so if we think about civil society that way, people are trying to understand how they can distance themselves and their system of cooperation from the state of nature. So the more rule following you have at the upper echelon of society, you are distancing yourself from that lowly state of nature that others live in. But throughout history, we make this moral discovery that no, there is no such thing as this moral hierarchy where some people are morally superior, morally worthy because they follow rules, but in fact, people have equal moral status. And it's those who recognize that equal moral status are the ones who are deserving of place in this conversation, right? So can we think about civility as, yeah, there is a norm, prescription about what civility is, and that as a society we are in a process of discovery as to what that is, and we are closer to the criteria of civility than we were in the 1600s.
Yeah, no, I think that's wonderful. I mean, as demographically, as a classically angry white male hetero guy who had to learn, by watching and looking all sorts of different ways to function, right? The idea of prescriptive rules, right, a protocol in particular situations is appealing to me, rather than our cloaked, or what it can be perceived to be, a cloaked, hierarchical system. And I guess part of that's what I'm aiming at. Again, I don't have answers, but what I was asked to imagine is a more formal, widespread, set of protocols and discipline. I like that. Again, that's just sort of, who cares what I like? That's what I would prefer. Because if I can read, if you show me what the code and rules are, then I can abide by that, and then we can find some sort of common way of interacting. That's better than a verb. Much. You want to call it?
We should cover
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Thank you. Sorry for our short sessions. Our last speaker is Stephen Winter. He is a distinguished professor, and I don't mean he's just distinguished as a professor, I mean he's a distinguished professor. The Walter S. Gibbs Distinguished Professor in the law school, and so Stephen Winter, Professor Stephen Winter.
I'm not making any slides. My old eyes better with my wrong direction. Too technical on that. All right, thank you. So before I take you deep into the philosophical weeds so late in the day, the young woman in the back there earlier said, speaking of the Black Lives Matter and the African American protests, since when is the simple assertion of one's humanity political? And the punchline of my argument is that recognition of each other's humanity is the essence of politics. So that's where I'm going with this. So, in contemporary usage, civility and politics are semantic and practical opposites. Civility connotes courtesy, politeness, and respect. Politics, on the other hand, is the competitive enterprise of obtaining and keeping power. Civility in the public sphere is vanishing as politicians increasingly demonize opponents and scapegoat outsiders in order to mobilize their supporters, who in turn organize themselves as warring tribes. Our language was not always so gauche. Etymologically, civility and politics share a common origin in notions of communal membership. Civility is from the Latin civilitas, the art of governing, or citizenship, while politics is from the Greek politis, for citizen, and politia, for the art of citizenship. As Guillaume de Lapierre observes in his 16th century work, Le Droit Politique, policy is derived from the Greek word politia, which in our tongue we term civility, and that which the Greeks called political government, the Latins called the government of a republic or civil society. The modern sense of civility as politeness derives from the understanding that some level of restraint in civil interaction is necessary for public peace. This modern sense, however, is doubly degraded. On one hand, it connotes the minimal level of courtesy necessary for social life, as in the phrases mere civility or please be civil. On the other hand, this narrow sense, shorn as it is of its original connotation of citizenship and the equality of respect that entails, often operates to preserve privilege. Under conditions of hierarchy, the demand for decorum is likely to mean that the subordinate are expected to display deference and respect, and the best example of that, of course, is the kneeling protest of the NFL players. The semantic shift in the meaning of civility is a reflection of the profound social and epistemic changes of modernity. As Benjamin Constant famously explains, quote, the aim of the ancients was to share social power among the citizens of a single country. That's what they called liberty. The aim of the moderns is to be secure in their private benefits. Central to our aspirations is a conception of freedom as self-sovereignty that is corrosive of social bonds and destructive of the very idea of collective self-government. Incivility is the inevitable precipitate. In today's parlance, it's not a bug, it's a feature. Our contemporary understanding of freedom is rooted in the Enlightenment's dualist schema of subject and object. By radically separating the subject from the objects of its inquiry, the dualist schema makes modern science possible. The objectification of nature is extended to human behavior, and this produces, as Charles Taylor notes, an associationist psychology, utilitarian ethics, atomistic politics of social engineering, and ultimately a mechanistic science of man. Nowhere is this last point more true than in the fields of economics and rational choice theory, but this form of scientific explanation, with its abstraction from history, culture, and psychosocial context, separates actual historical subjects from the grounds of their own intelligibility. Such reductive explanations, Merleau-Ponty says, quote, destroy the mixture we are made of and make us incomprehensible to ourselves. The Enlightenment schema of subject and object not only isolates the subject from the objects of its inquiry itself and its history, but also isolates the subject from other subjects. Its focus is on the individual consciousness and its relation to the world. Within this schema, social context can only be seen as an external condition and constraint. Freedom, Taylor explains, can on this view only be conceptualized in terms of, quote, a set of limits to be overcome or a mere occasion to carry out some freely chosen project, which is all that a situation can be within the conception of freedom as self-dependence, close quote. The modern understanding of freedom, then, is of a self-propelled agent released from the limits of the older feudal and religious orders, who is now free to think, act, and choose according to reason alone. It expects, indeed is expected, to rise above the social limits of origin and class to achieve according to merit and ambition. It acknowledges no constraints except those it recognizes for itself. Social context is not just something to be transcended, it is exactly what the Enlightenment has sloughed off in the name of freedom. This view, which I call freedom as transcendence, leads to three paradoxes. First, modern subjectivity and its concomitant understanding of freedom are themselves particular historical developments nurtured by an entire ensemble of social and political institutions that include not just the consumer market and the liberal state, but also the modern novel, the popular media, and the educational system. It emerges from and is sustained by a form of life that validates the individual over the social, the chosen over the inherited, and what is exceptional and unique over what is common and shared. This view of freedom and individualism is constitutive of who we are. Yet, and here's the paradox, it is not a philosophy or value system that we ourselves have chosen. For us, it has the force of necessity. Second, the freedom of modern subjectivity is its own kind of prison. The idea of the individual human consciousness as source of value and self-directing agent is both the great achievement of modernity and its undoing. As de Tocqueville warned, quote, individualism at first only dams the springs of public virtues, but in the long run it attacks and destroys all the others too, and finally emerges in egoism. The slide from subjectivity to subjectivism progresses inevitably from egoism through atomism to alienation. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the United States, where taxes paid to sustain the common enterprise of democratic self-government are experienced as a kind of extortion, and mandatory participation in an insurance pool run by private firms is excoriated as a form of socialism. Constant feared that tyrants would, quote, reconstitute the new social state by deploying, quote, prejudices to frighten men, egoism to corrupt them, frivolity to stupefy them, and gross pleasures to degrade them. Now you're thinking Trump, but long before him, we've been doing it to ourselves. As the dominant social forms, consumer and celebrity culture represent the pathological extremes of modern subjectivity. Consumerism is defined by a regressive narcissism in which relations with one's commodities rival or surpass those with other humans. The smartphone is the apotheosis of this. Consumption, Jean Baudrillard says, is un discours à soi-même, a conversation with oneself. The pathological individualism of celebrity culture is evident in the compulsion for 15 seconds of fame that drives reality television, but it is yet more disturbing in its more conventional form. The central dynamic of identification with favorite sports, music, or movie stars is to participate vicariously in their triumphs and adulation. Fans, as Roger Calois observes, quote, live in imagination the sumptuous and full life that they can never experience themselves, which the media, quote, dramatically describe to them daily. He concludes, this superficial and vague but permanent, tenacious, and universal identification constitutes one of the essential compensatory mechanisms of democratic society. Perhaps this descent into atomism, alienation, and anomie is just an historical fortuity, but there is reason to think otherwise. The third paradox is that freedom as transcendence makes a promise that cannot be redeemed. At the pragmatic level, social context is not something that can be sloughed off. Particular social structures can be transformed or replaced, but another social structure always takes its place. I may leave a family, a job, or a profession because I find it too stifling, but I inevitably start another relationship, take another job, or choose another calling that brings with it some new set of constraints. At the theoretical level, freedom as transcendence is either impossible or empty. It is impossible, Taylor explains, because, quote, it is defined in such a way that complete freedom would mean the abolition of all situation. And it is empty because a free self that transcended all the traditions, institutions, relationships, groups, values, and social expectations that defined it would, as Taylor says, be characterless and without defined purpose. How would it choose? What would it strive for? On what terms would it even think? Absolute subjectivity, Merleau-Ponty shrewdly observes, is nothing but an abstract notion of myself. We can escape these paradoxes only if we overcome the dualism of subject and object, subject and context, reconceptualize the relation between the individual and the social, and focus instead on intersubjectivity. Actual human beings are socially situated and socially dependent. We are finite, embodied creatures who exist in time, in culture, and language. We are the products of particular forms of life and possessed of and by particular perspectives. History and culture are the context in which we know. The fact that, quote, I am a psychological and historical structure, Merleau-Ponty points out, does not limit my access to the world, but on the contrary, is my means of entering in communication with it. Culture and community are not external constraints that the individual must rise above. They are our very conditions of possibility. We are, in short, excuse me, this is from Merleau-Ponty as well, through and through compounded of relationships with the world. Now, to say that subjectivity is constituted in relationships is not to reduce the subject to its social determinants, but rather to emphasize its dynamic qualities. Where modern subjectivity conduces to subjectivism, this understanding of subjectivity is, in a word, reflexive, though it necessarily reflects the social circumstances and history through which it is constituted. Subjectivity is simultaneously that which expresses, enacts, and thereby changes that context. Quote, man is a being with a natural and social situation, but one who is also open, active, and able to establish his autonomy on the very ground of his dependence, close quote. We do so, quote, not by destroying necessity, but on the contrary, by utilizing it. On this view, freedom is a function of context. It adheres in our situated capacity to transform rather than transcend the conditions in which we live. Freedom, too, is an emergent condition of a social situation. It is not just that our agency is dependent on the social practices and historical conditions through which we are constituted, but also that our capacity to act on the world depends on the recognition and the cooperation of others. I'm going to explore both those points in the last section. Consider first what Robert Pippin identifies as Hegel's logic of action. For Hegel, the paradigm of, quote, of an acting subject so stubbornly insistent on the decisive role of his subjectively formulated intention, so insistent on the individual authority to determine what was done and what the scope of such action should include, is a kind of violation of pathology. This is so because the meaning of action, both what was done and what was intended, is itself a social product. Regardless of what I intend, my action obtains meaning only in its expression. One, I may be wrong about my own intentions. Two, my motivation may appear different to me as I enact it in front of others and assimilate their reaction. And three, the subsequent interpretations of the audience may change my own sense of what I have done. As Hegel says, one sometimes, quote, learns from the deed. Thus Pippin concludes, quote, in Hegel's view, actually to have an intention is to struggle to express that intention in a public and publicly contestable deed, subject to appropriations and interpretations by others that can greatly alter one's own sense of what one is about. To give an example, I may act in a manner I think brilliant or virtuous, but if others find my actions banal or alarming, I will be forced to confront my own intentions. I may decide that everyone else is wrong and stubbornly insist on the probity of my motives, or I may come to see that I have acted out of vanity, insecurity, or insensitivity. All of us have had the experience of saying something in all innocence, and when seeing the reactions of others, realizing that we had been thoughtless, inappropriate, or hurtful. In such cases, public reception changes both the meaning of what we have done and our own sense of who we are. It follows that freedom to act is itself a shared social freedom because the meaning and intent of that act is necessarily a social phenomenon. As Pippin says, action for Hegel, quote, must be understood as a self-negation in this sense, a negation of the subject's pretension to complete ownership of the nature and import of the deed, and therewith the sharing of such authority with others. In other words, self, meaning, and authority are all intersubjective phenomena. Intersubjectivity here connotes something interior to and more profound than Habermas's sense of communicative interaction, for it is constitutive of both meaning and subjectivity, one's very status as an individual, who one is, what one does, even what one intends, is an intersubjective production that is dependent on the understanding and recognition of others. Which is, of course, why it matters to me that everyone introduces me as being a distinguished professor. That's the whole point of getting that label, right, is to get the recognition of others. This account of the meaning of action as necessarily outside one's control raises an obvious problem. How do I recognize a deed as my own when it's subject to the appropriations and interpretations of others? To put it differently, if the meaning of my action is dependent on the interpretations of others, I stand in constant danger of alienation. To guarantee against this possibility, I would need some reason to be confident that others recognize my deed, its description, and my motivation in the same manner that I do myself. For Hegel, this is true only in a certain historical form of ethical life that manifests objective rationality, but none of us believe that. Right? Since we can no longer credit his strong teleological account, we're left with the more fragile and indefinite notion that it will be true and my act will be free, only if it takes place under conditions of solidarity and mutual recognition and respect. Second, freedom is irreducibly social in that it depends on the cooperation of others. Consider the paradox of autonomy and democracy that Frank Michelman calls the institutional difficulty. Democracy cannot be about autonomous individuals living only by those rules they give themselves. In the context of unavoidable plurality, that could only mean anarchy, which is one way of describing what is going on at the national political level in the United States today. At some point, people who feel one way about a matter of social life will have to accede to the majority's determination that things ought to be different. Democracy, therefore, requires the institutions and dispositions that make it possible to achieve, if not consensus, at least a sense of identification with the decisions of the polity as one's own. Democracy depends on some mechanism of participation, identification, or solidarity that connects the citizen to the political community. Indeed, the underlying conception of autonomy as self-legislation is impossibly severe. As Hannah Arendt says, quote, if it were true that sovereignty and freedom are the same, then indeed no man could be free, because sovereignty, the ideal of uncompromising self-sufficiency and mastership, is contradictory to the very conditions of plurality. Conditions, singular, of plurality. For mortal humans, who are necessarily constituted by and dependent on others, self-legislation is a chimerical objective. For only collective action can address the many important issues, both large and small, that comprise our well-being and determine our fate. To take a simple example, if I determine that stopping or reversing climate change is a moral imperative, I'm going to need to do a lot more than just take the initiative to replace my incandescent light bulbs with the more planet-friendly squiggly kind. Even personal self-governance, as in the case of sexuality and other intimate personal relations, will require the assistance or participation of others. In other words, it will require one to engage in politics. Self-governance must be understood not as self-legislation, autonomy in the literal sense, but as the capacity to exercise initiative with respect to one's fate. And, as our examination of Hegel's logic of action revealed, that more realistic measure of autonomy can only count as free under conditions of mutual recognition and respect. Democracy, on this view, is the sharing of authority with others under conditions of mutual recognition and respect, right, as the art of citizenship. Which brings us to what we might call the wisdom of the ancients. Arendt says that for the Greeks, freedom was understood as, quote, a form of political organization in which the citizens lived together under conditions of no rule. For Arendt, it was significant that they used the terms, that the term they used for freedom and for democracy, and this was the term before the word democracy was even coined, was isonomy, in Greek isonomia. She stresses that the Greek suffix is archi, right, which means to rule, and krasi, C-R-A-C-Y, which comes from the Greek kratos for power, are entirely absent from this linguistic expression. But the import of no rule, this is now Arendt's term, is opaque. Isonomia, which is a compound of isos, meaning equal, and nomos, meaning law, is, after all, not anarchy. Anarchy comes from anarchine, which means without leader. Aristotle renders the concept more accurately as to rule and be ruled in turn, a reference to the use of lot and rotation in the selection of offices. But even this concept of alternating rulership fails to explain how isonomia correlates with freedom. At any given moment, some group of specific humans presumably is in charge, and everyone else is subject to their rule. Arendt is in fact wrong. Isonomia had nothing to do with no rule. Rather, it was the most prominent of a trio of cognate terms for democracy and its institutions that included isogoria, the equal right to address the assembly, and isokratia, equality of power. What made isonomia a synonym for freedom was an understanding of politics founded on a strong idea of equality. Martin Ostwald tells us that nomos abruptly replaced thesmos as the Greek word for law, and that this occurred at the time of the democratic reforms of Cleisthenes around 508, 507 BC. While thesmos signifies, quote, something imposed by an external agency conceived as standing apart and on a higher plane than the ordinary, nomos implies an obligation, quote, motivated less by the authority of the agent who imposed it than by the fact that it is regarded and accepted as valid by those who live under it. Victor Ehrenberg explains that by the time of Cleisthenes' reforms, isonomia had come to mean, quote, not a state of equal law for everybody, but, quote, the ideal of a community in which the citizens had their equal share. Equality for the ancient Greeks was not a natural right, but a social creation. It was constructed in the public sphere through participation in communal self-governance. As Arendt observes, quote, men were by nature not equal and needed an artificial institution, the polis, which by virtue of its nomos would make them equal. Thus, Martin Oswald explains, for the Greeks, freedom and equality, as well as the state itself, are entities that citizens share through the community to which they belong. Summing up, no rule is every bit as illusory and ideal as self-rule. In the real world, we necessarily engage with others in an ongoing scheme of social life. The democratic regime designated by Autonomy does not promise each individual person actual authorship of the laws. Rather, it promises the dignity of equal participation in governance under terms of mutual recognition and respect. Self-governance on this view is a function of contribution and not control. It requires politics. It is not a matter of self-legislation, but of effective social action. And this, in turn, depends on cooperation and coordination. Only through such collective action can we hope, in Arendt's words, to dispose of the future as though it were the present. Politics is a necessary condition of the intersubjective relation between socially situated individuals who need each other to succeed and inevitably are not of a single mind. It requires tolerance, pragmatism, negotiation, compromise, cooperation, and the capacity to seek common ground. And if we asked for a definition of civility, that's the one that I would put on offer. When politics is instead played as a zero-sum game, the inevitable results are polarization, stalemate, and oppression. Once people are oriented to politics as just another competitive market for maximizing preferences, the necessary conditions for success, that is civility, are destroyed. Which is not to suggest that civility requires harmony or the suppression of difference. Where there is already agreement, there is by definition no need for politics. It is to suggest that civility in its commodious sense requires agonism without antagonism. For politics to succeed, we must engage with one another as protagonists in a common project of collective self-governance. And that is possible only when we can come together to exercise influence over our fate under conditions of mutual recognition and